Hey now, we are getting over, and I am the Silver King, Adam Silverstein, here to lead you through these hard times. That early Wednesday morning with a special instant reaction edition of your favorite professional wrestling podcast. That's right, Getting Over is back once again with the Silver King and vintage Chris Vanini dropping an instant review of Mr. McMahon, the 6-part docuseries feature on former WWE chairman Vince McMahon that debuted earlier this morning on Netflix. But before we get to that, let's start with this. A reminder that the Getting Over Wrestling podcast
is all about Defy.
So please head on over to Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Leave a 5-star rating on Apple. Take a little extra time. Leave a 5-star written review. If you do, we will read it live right here on the show. Don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube at Getting Overcast and follow us on Twitter at Getting Overcast for episode drops, news, analysis, highlights, all that good stuff. And please also remember,
I happen to love the number 5.
and I hope you do as well, because for $5 a month or $50 for the entire year, you can become an official Getting Overhead. Just visit buymeacoffee.com/gettingover. Sign up. You will get bonus audio, the fastest 5 minutes in professional wrestling, instant reactions to every major TV show, along with exclusive news and analysis on Fridays. Again, that is buymeacoffee.com/gettingover. Please support the continuation of the Getting Over Wrestling podcast, along with instant reaction episodes like this, and of course, our instant analysis shows coming out of premium live events and pay-per-views. And since we published this show less than 24 hours after our WWE episode for the week, let me just remind you that is awaiting in your podcast feed if you have not listened to it already. We go deep on Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes, Jey Uso winning the Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship, the build for WWE Bad Blood. Next week is the Ultimate Preview episode, by the way. We cover all of that and much more. Do not miss this week's WWE episode. Okay, back to the topic at hand. Chris, welcome to the program. You know, we always tell our Getting Overheads that we work our asses off to deliver them the best shows possible, the highest value, performance-enhancing audio for their ear holes that we can muster. And while I have no idea how this episode is going to turn out, binging Mr. McMahon to offer this first look review was quite an endeavor on my part. So I'm going to give us both a little Barry Horowitz pat on the back for getting on and knocking this out. I have no idea how you fit all of it in, given this ongoing conference realignment nonsense that's happening in college sports.
Yeah, it's been a busy week, but this docuseries that we knew was coming out that had a lot of hype around it for years, I was just like, I was more interested in this than maybe any wrestling documentary I could think of. I mean, it, like we've always said, it was the one story that had kind of never been told, or at least not in this form. So I was like, I got to watch this as quickly as I can, as much as I can.
There's no doubt about that. For every major story that we've heard in and around professional wrestling, the one that has always eluded us is the complete telling of the Vince McMahon biography, basically. The question is, did we get that here with Mr. McMahon? Let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into it. What I figured we can do is start this off by providing our overall thoughts about the docuseries in perhaps more vague terms to a degree, just so as not to spoil anything contained within. And then we can go through each episode briefly with any particular notes or reactions that we wish to share. That will probably be helpful for folks who do not yet subscribe to Netflix and want to know whether it's worth the cost to subscribe, now, a couple months before Raw actually debuts in January. So let me set the stage like this. Mr. McMahon is quite comprehensive. It's 6 episodes at about an hour each. In terms of names, it's basically the entire family: Linda, Stephanie, Shane, Paul Levesque, the vast majority of big-time superstars: The Undertaker, Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, John Cena, Cody Rhodes, Trish Stratus, Shawn Michaels. Then you have the likes of Paul Heyman, Eric Bischoff, Bruce Pritchard, numerous other wrestlers, wrestling reporters, and more traditional journalists, especially those that broke the major scandal around McMahon in 2024. You had executives from USA Network, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then you had Phil Mushnick, the top critic of WWF when I was growing up, who was always on a vendetta against the company. Sometimes legitimate criticism, sometimes muckraking, and sometimes just hating on WWF by surfacing complaints from like the parent television group and, bitching about some of the, more risque things they did on television. I was actually surprised he was included, given my perspective has been that he's had a clear bias against the company for decades. It's one thing to be a critic. It's one thing to be critical. It's one thing to be a reporter and try to investigate wrongdoing. It's another to have bias while you're doing that. And for those who don't know, he's a New York Post sports columnist, not a reporter. So they didn't necessarily present him as that, which I thought was interesting. I would say the most notable person absent from interviews was Roman Reigns in terms of being a major modern day player who just was not accounted for during the documentary. And there are certainly folks in AEW, Jim Ross and Chris Jericho most notably, who would have been valuable contributors, along with others outside of wrestling these days who saw a lot go down, probably could have served similarly valuable to the documentarians. Trish was also the only women's wrestler included, other than a brief appearance by Wendy Richter to speak about herself. That seemed like an oversight as well. There were over 100 hours of interviews conducted beginning in 2021, lasting the better part of 4 years, even though the effort was supposed to end in 2022. Breaking news of McMahon's original scandal that ultimately led to his retirement halted production before the final interview with Vince was scheduled. The use of archival footage, I thought it was immense. WWE clearly opened its production doors. The whole concept was that they were working in concert, but they had zero editorial oversight over the docuseries. And what needs to be known off the top is this was not an expose or a piece of investigative journalism, because most everything about McMahon has been out in public, even if the intimate details of much of it remain private because he insulates himself so well. It was more of a portrait of a man who's obviously been immensely successful, but seen that success while being constantly shrouded in controversy. A creative genius and master of business who was so involved in so many salacious stories that the idea of separating the man, Vince McMahon, from the character of Mr. McMahon proved so difficult that even he struggled to do it as the documentary went on. There was a great line from Paul Heyman late in the series that kind of summed it up. The Shakespearean tragedy of this tale is that the great success that has been enjoyed by Vincent Kennedy McMahon was driven by the overcompensatory behavior rebelling against the first miserable 12 years of his life. And escaping that abuse has been his life pursuit in creating an atmosphere in which he is untouchable and invulnerable to outside forces and in control of his own destiny. I thought that was a perfect way to sum up McMahon and really the focus of the entire series. So as an overall review, I'd say it did succeed in laying bare the complete story of McMahon, obviously the most important figure in wrestling history, arguably its greatest villain as well. And seeing Vince speak on the record in detail about much of his career, I thought it was a unique experience, but it also was light on revelations. It didn't exactly separate fact from fiction much, and it's better suited for casual fans or non-wrestling aficionados who would undoubtedly learn a ton from this, way more than they would from anything else that's probably been made about Vince. For you and I and folks listening to this show, there were a few nuggets of value, and it was nice to see a documentary of this length and depth created outside WWE's walls, but it was not some eye-opening experience that ultimately taught us that much. At least I'm speaking for myself when I say that.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I come out of it thinking like, man, I wish this was like 10 episodes. Like, I'd love to go even deeper. And then there's part of me who's like, well, maybe this could have been 3, because about half of this is just the history of the WWE, which wrestling fans know. They'll talk about the rise of Stone Cold and Hulk Hogan and the Attitude Era and the Ruthless Aggression and like a lot of stuff in there that, you know, and honestly, some of it didn't seem to fit. There'd be like a serious scandal they'd go into, and then it'd cut to like WrestleMania 30 in the streak. And it was like this. That part was a little bit weird. By far, the most interesting part of this is just Vince McMahon and everything he says in it.
Right.
Because we've never heard him talk like this before. And all of these interviews were conducted before the initial scandal broke in 2022. In fact, it looked like it broke during one of the interviews.
It did.
And then Vince never came back. So we don't get him commenting on any of that stuff.
He was literally sorry to interrupt you. He was literally sitting down to do the interview. It broke. He stood up, walked away. They never did the interview. That's what happened.
Correct. But before that, you get a lot of Vince talking about his childhood and talking about Linda and his father and his affairs and types of things. The only thing anybody knows, and they even say this in the doc, the only thing anybody knows about Vince's childhood is what he said in a Playboy interview in like 2000 or something like that. And we've never heard from Vince that story. And he does go into a lot of it. It gets into a lot of the deplorable, whatever you think of Vince McMahon, deplorable human being, creative genius, a mix of the both, whatever. It was intensely compelling to finally hear him talk about that because he is maybe the most influential person in the history of professional wrestling. And like you said with that Paul Heyman quote, you can really see how growing up those first 12 years without his father, abuse in his home growing up from his parents, you can see how that shaped what he became and everything he did. And I think that's important, not to excuse anything,
right?
Just to know, just to understand this person and have a full picture of what they've done. So the Vince stuff is by far the most interesting. The wrestling stuff, the history of WWE, I didn't really care for that. But you say my other two big takeaways. One, all the Vince stuff in his reflections. The second part was they do touch on every single scandal that happened under Vince.
Major scandal.
Yes. It's not just the steroid scandal. It's not just Chris Benoit. The Ring Boy thing is in there. Rita Chatterton is in there. There are a lot of not just casual fans, but normal wrestling fans who probably don't know these things. I didn't know much about the Ring Boy scandal until the past couple of years. It's just something people didn't know. Now, yes, they don't prosecute the case in all these situations, but they do bring it to a new audience. And I think that was really important. And I know a lot of people were concerned that they may just tell the old WWE story and ignore certain things like a lot of these do. They do not. It is extremely comprehensive.
And that, I think, is an important point because, look, I wrote a review, an extensive review in full that you can read on Mr. McMahon. You can search Mr. McMahon review and my name, and I promise you will find it. And I read other reviews that came out Tuesday because we got, copies ahead of release. And it was nice, of course, of Netflix. Thank you, Netflix, for providing that opportunity. But I read others' reviews because I wanted to see what did they think of it compared to what I thought of it. And I saw people kind of tearing this apart. They didn't go hard enough on McMahon and they didn't do this and this. And we'll get to that. And we can discuss whether we felt it was fair, whether they should have made it an investigative piece, so on and so forth. But I think what was most important is that they didn't gloss over anything. Where pretty much any other documentary that you've seen about either McMahon or about WWE involving McMahon, and especially if one was created by WWE itself, absolutely would have. And you mentioned some of them, but I'll just list them for you. In terms of what was covered, they went through the lawsuits from John Stossel and Richard Belzer, allegations of sexual assault from the former referee, Rita Chatterton, allegations of sexual harassment from former employees, the steroid scandal that sent McMahon to trial against the U.S. government in 1994, the hotel room death of Jimmy Snuka's girlfriend, and whether Vince possibly helped cover it up. Obviously, there was a dark side of the ring about that, but they also didn't come to any conclusions that could have been utilized here. The in-arena death of Owen Hart, of course, Chris Benoit's murder-suicide, and the final 20 minutes of the last episode, which, again, let's repeat, this was created way before the scandal broke. The scandal was not part of, the documentary when it was initially conceptualized. The final 20 minutes of the last episode, after they had already taped 100 hours of interviews, are spent exclusively on the revelations made from Janelle Grant and others that, of course, added up to the nearly $15 million of payouts for covering up sexual misconduct and, as Grant alleges, sexual abuse and sex trafficking, all of which led to Vince's resignation, which, of course, we and everyone thought would never happen, especially when he came back the second time and got the job with TKO Group. So you can...
To that point, real quick, they even mentioned like him changing the board so we can come back.
Yeah, they went through
Stephanie left the company after Vince came in, and the dynamics between them. Like, they did touch on all of that stuff. And I would just note real quick, Janelle Grant is not in the documentary. She had a media briefing last week. I asked her lawyer if she was asked to be in the documentary and said no. The lawyer spokesperson just said she just wants to tell her story on her terms. So it does appear that they tried to get her in it. She didn't want to be, but it is all addressed.
That makes sense. I would also think that if they brought her on, they would need some other type of perspective. Otherwise, it's just reporters and Janelle Grant and then no one representing the other side. So that might have been difficult to accomplish anyway. But you made a great point about Stephanie's resignation when he returned. They also get in depth on Vince's relationship with Shane, and a lot of perhaps that's not as controversial, but it's a lot of stuff that we wanted to know that we learn a little bit about, enough about. Clearly what they're willing to tell us is all that we're going to get. They can't dig and uncover stuff if Vince and Shane are not willing to share it, right? So I think we did get some to that. But again, I want to speak to the larger point. If this did omit, maybe they couldn't have omitted Owen and Benoit because those were so public and so obvious. But if they omitted Snuka and Rita Chatterton, by the way, I forgot to mention, Ashley Massaro is mentioned as well, briefly, but she is mentioned.
Very important.
If they ignored, let's say, those three stories, then we could say, hey, you know what? They touched on some important stuff, but they really didn't cover the full gamut of McMahon's misdeeds. I think that's completely incorrect to state that. It is fair to say that they did not go deep enough into the general misdeeds of what happened on a regular basis in and around WWF and then certainly becoming WWE. There's a lot of shady business practices that Vince allegedly employed when he was taking over the territories and stealing talent and all that. And they touched on some of that, but they didn't get into the details. There was obviously the plane ride from hell and numerous other situations that they could have touched on. If they were going to do that, a 6-hour documentary becomes 10, 12, and you can go on forever. So what they said was, hey, you know what? We're going to kind of omit some stuff that, is bad, but not as bad, perhaps, even though it's tough to kind of make a morality judgment on what's worse than something else, right? They decided we're going to omit some of that, probably for time. We're going to leave that on the cutting room floor. That way we can address every single major issue, which they absolutely did, and they deserve credit for that. But what they also did, and whether you feel they deserve criticism for it or not is really up to you, but Bruce Pritchard voiced displeasure over the documentary's depiction of McMahon, having seen a cut of it before the final interviews were taped. I do believe it's fair to point out that some of his potentially more admirable qualities, such as his generosity, which is what Pritchard was referring to, they were never really touched on in the series. There were hardly any amusing anecdotes like we have seen in other documentaries involving McMahon or about WWE. So they covered every major controversy, but I think if they left some of the more general negative stuff out, then it's also okay to leave some of the more general positive stuff out. It's a equitable balance of omission, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, but also, like, you think you would get a lot of that stuff from the family, That's usually who turned to for those anecdotes, and instead we got Stephanie saying Vince wanted to put her wedding on pay-per-view.
Well, that's what they aired, though. I mean,
right.
They spoke for hundreds, 100 hours plus to everyone.
Right. And you've got Shane saying, my dad finally said he respected me, and I said that's all I ever wanted,
right.
and so they really did lean into that part. But yeah, you're right. In terms of other acts, you couldn't tell. Also, by the way, they talked about Donald Trump and Lyndon McMahon being in his cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's another thing that just kind of gets brushed aside in all of this as you talk through everything. I think, and by the way, to your point, it does end with the Janelle Grant lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned that the Wall Street Journal reported Brock Lesnar was the one who Janelle Grant was offered to. So that's how they send you home. You know, they send you home with the worst of the worst stuff.
The meat.
And
yeah.
I came out of it at the end. Just I don't say forgotten, but I'd kind of kept it out of my mind, some of the worst details of that lawsuit, which was horrifying to read the first time I did. And they talk about all of it, and it is pretty obviously deplorable. And so, and to that point, it is wild that this is happening on Netflix.
Yeah,
which is just about to get Monday Night Raw, which recently signed a deal with Monday Night Raw, which they acknowledge in the documentary. And this was produced in conjunction with The Ringer, which also has a business relationship with WWE. So, you know, we talk, I mean, if you've seen any of those Netflix Untold documentaries, those have not been great for the most part.
They're
Some
shit.
of them have
They're shit.
They've been downright bad.
Let's just be candid. They're shit. I mean, respect to Netflix for this, but the Untolds are shit. They did one on the Swamp Kings, the Florida Gators, which I know intimately, and I know those teams intimately. I was around them, the players, interviewed many of them, covered the teams. It was awful. I mean, it just straight up was. And this was not that.
This, which is made by a different production company, is not that. It is a totally different thing, and really, I thought just really, really well done.
Two other general items I wanted to talk about. They're both brief, and then maybe we can go episode by episode in some of the individual items and revelations that we want to discuss. I'm sure there were legal reasons for this, but seeing the company written and referred to as WWE every single time, even when talking about stuff that happened from the 70s and 80s, it was very odd to me as a viewer who knows better. They do ultimately talk about WWF changing to E, but it was almost as if
you're talking about the subtitles, right?
No, I'm not even talking about the subtitles. Although, yes, they would say Federation and it would say Entertainment on the bottom. Yeah. I am aware of that. But no, I meant like, for example, episode 1, they show pictures of the territories, right? And instead of it saying CWC, Capital Wrestling Corporation, or WWWF, the big territory in the Northeast was called WWE, which it just was not. I mean, it's straight up inaccurate. And they did it throughout the entire, like when Vince bought WWE from his father, Vincent McMahon Sr. No, he did not buy WWE from his father. And I know that there may be legal reasons involved in that. I totally understand. But I've never heard it done that way before.
I just don't think you need to explain Capital Wrestling, WWF, and then to W. They do the WWF to WWE.
Briefly. Most people know. Like 4 episodes into it, they do.
Right, but I'm saying I don't think the previous name changes are needed.
It's not about covering the name changes. It's not about covering the name changes. It's about being accurate.
Yeah.
That's all. It's just accuracy. So as someone who's seen many wrestling documentaries, including them made by WWE, they still haven't done that. So I thought that was odd. And then separate from that, Shane McMahon, physically, we'll talk about the way he was covered in this documentary, but physically, he looked great and healthy.
He did.
During his interview, way better than the way we saw him like most recently on TV. It was almost shocking that he was that healthy and that fit and, put together, because he always looks blown up when he's in the ring, all red in the face and huge, and he can't breathe. So I don't know if he, went on a regimen or lost a lot of weight, or maybe had a blood pressure. I can't even speculate, but I was thrown, not just the first time I saw him, but consistently during this documentary. I'm like, man, Shane looks good. So good for him.
He did too. Everybody, I thought everybody looked pretty good in this, all things considered. So
except for Vince, but yeah, that's fair.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say. No, Vince looked fine compared to the Vince we've seen now.
Well, sure, this was 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Right, 3 years ago. Like, you compare 3 years ago to now when we saw him with the mustache. I can't believe that freaking mustache. and the dyed black hair.
So bad.
Seeing him 3 years ago tonight, like, wow, like he really, really did kind of go off the deep end or something. So.
But even here, he still had the eyebrows painted, and it was so distracting throughout the entire time. All right, so let's go episode by episode here. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what happens in each episode. These are going to be brief. Some individual items that I thought were intriguing. And of course, Chris, pop in on any individual thing I say or at the end if you want to add anything that you recall coming out of the episode. So the first episode is called Junior. It's largely focused on Vince taking over the company, the rise of Hulk Hogan, McMahon's business acumen expanding WWF from beyond a territorial company into something that was legitimately national, using cable TV, also Cyndi Lauper and MTV, WrestleMania 1, and then WWF legitimately becoming mainstream. It also went over the Stossel and Belzer lawsuits that I mentioned earlier. So that's what happens in episode 1. Bret Hart kind of leads the charge, setting the stage, explaining professional wrestling, which was appropriate. It was kind of hysterical how he kept putting himself over, like multiple times. He's like, I was really good at this. I was the best. At one point, he calls himself a true artist, which is just so Bret to make a documentary about someone else, praiseworthy of his wrestling skill. I loved that. We heard a lot about Vince's background and abuse. You touched on that a moment ago, saying he didn't know his dad until he was 12. That was covered. I found it revealing. He never asked Vince Sr. why he wasn't part of his life for the decade plus that he was estranged. And Sr. never once apparently said he was proud of him until he bought the company and vanquished all his competitors. Then he never said he loved him until literally the day before he died. That relationship and the coverage of it really bears fruit when it comes to depictions of Junior and how he operates his relationship with Shane throughout the entire documentary. And my most notable issue with this episode was how little time was spent on his life before wrestling. It was clear that his father impacted him psychologically, and that could have bore even more fruit throughout the documentary if we had learned more about it initially. It almost sounds like, and my guess is Vince thought he could puppeteer and puppet master this entire deal, but I have to imagine they asked him a lot more about his upbringing and younger life, and he just either didn't talk about it or they didn't use it. But either way, that was a rare opportunity to get Vince on the record about his upbringing, both when he was poor and then when he, started living with his dad. I don't even think they explained why he got back in touch with his dad and how that transpired. But that was a rare opportunity for them to actually tell us something that we needed to know on the record that we didn't. I mean, there have been stories about it. I think that Ringmaster book, I want to say, it's an unauthorized biography, and it speaks to people who are not Vince about his background and youth. Mm-hmm. But I wanted all that shit on the record, and I thought that was one of the biggest missed opportunities in the entire documentary.
Well, it's possible they ask. They do come back to it in later episodes, but
they touch on
it. You get a lot from Vince, which is like a bad thing happened, deal with it, you move on, you move forward. I don't like to look backward. Mm-hmm. So it's possible he just kind of said that a lot, but to your point, his relationship with his dad and stuff like that, there was a lot of hearing that from Vince for the first time. Again, I thought that was the most interesting part of the entire documentary.
It was
kind of the first half of the first episode. And yeah, I would have
just left me wanting more. That's all.
I would have liked to go even deeper into that because that is the most unknown thing about Vince. Mm-hmm. But it did do a good job of setting the tone and kind of setting the foundation as kind of for like everything that was going to come after it.
You can see from that breakdown, the first half of episode 1, you can see through lines to every single thing that happened in his life, with the company, with his family, with his relationships with women. Truthfully, all of it is all part. It all stems from his relationship with his dad. It's, you want to play armchair psychologist. You can do that because of how complicated and psychologically traumatizing his youth and relationship with his father was. Again, doesn't excuse anything. It's just facts. Vince spoke for the first time about tensions with Gorilla Monsoon, who was known to be the heir apparent for Senior's company. And ultimately, he did receive, for those who don't know, shares of the company even after Junior bought it out. But I did not know there was tension between them, though, of course, that makes sense when a young kid comes in, buys the company out from a guy who thought he was going to inherit it. McMahon confirmed a story that Cody Rhodes told about a year ago about Vince originally wanting Dusty Rhodes to be his guy, like ahead of Hulk Hogan, as a more charismatic option to lead the company instead of Bob Backlund, who was champion at the time. But Dusty didn't believe in the concept. So Vince said, okay, signed Hogan. And of course, you got Hulkamania. And there was also footage of McMahon and Bob Costas serving as correspondents for the 3rd anniversary episode of David Letterman's late night show.
Yeah.
This threw me for a fucking loop. So let me be clear, okay? This was one of my favorite parts of the entire series because I have been a lifelong fan of David Letterman, and growing up as a sports fan, watching NBC, my uncle worked for NBC. He was an executive producer for sports. I met Bob Costas a bunch of times. I went to numerous games that he called. And of course, at the time, the Knicks were really good and the Dolphins were good too, Dan Marino. So Bob was calling my games that I grew up watching. And of course, Yankees games. He called millions of Yankees games. So these 3 guys, Letterman, Costas, and McMahon, were a huge part of my life growing up. And I had no idea this happened. Didn't know the footage existed. So when that went down, I'm like, holy shit, this documentary is going to kick my ass. Now, obviously, it didn't necessarily do that, but I loved that. It popped me huge.
I think that was key because you can see there that Vince McMahon is all about the entertainment business, and he knows what's hip and cool and how to lean into where society is. Because there's something toward the end of the series, I think. I don't know if it's him or somebody else who's just like, he always wanted to like fit in. And that goes back to his childhood and everything. And then you see this Letterman situation. You're like, wow, like this could have been Vince McMahon's career if he had just gone down a different path instead of wrestling or something like that. I don't know. But that was really cool footage. I had no idea. Bob Costas is in this a lot. I did not realize. Yeah. I hadn't realized this myself how connected Bob Costas was to the WWF and Vince, well before that XFL interview.
I knew much of it, but not all of it, and certainly not the Letterman situation, as you can now tell because I've just said it a couple times. So that was pretty much episode 1. Episode 2 was called Heat. It focused on WWE's growth through the early 90s, the steroid controversy and subsequent trial, how it toppled the WBF, World Bodybuilding Federation, given the timing, but of course that was also a really shitty idea. And it touched on a lot of the dirtiness behind the scenes, the death of Jimmy Snuka's girlfriend. There was lots of time spent on the Ring Boy scandal, as you mentioned earlier. I felt like Pat Patterson got a fair shake with opinions from both sides on it. The Rita Chatterton rape accusations, including her testimony on the Geraldo Rivera show. Vince addresses all of those to his credit in this situation. It covered the advent of Saturday night's main event and WWE actually taking the step to move on to network TV. Ironic, of course, considering it's restarting on NBC in a few months. I did roll my eyes, Chris, at how deep they got into the attendance of WrestleMania 3. As if that shit matters one iota. I know exactly who told them that it was important when it was not. You'll see him talk about it extensively in that segment. Guy's been harping on this shit for decades, but it felt so out of place and so unnecessary in a documentary about Vince McMahon. And if you take that out, you can add something else that's probably more important and interesting. There's a great clip where Vince McMahon cuts a tape saying that WWF will be drug-free entertainment, but the camera stays on him. We see what happens after it gets cut. He immediately sinks his head and shows that sinister look, and then he makes a gesture of disgust that was like a paradigm showcasing his frontward-facing persona, like the one that was featured during so many of the interviews. And then you saw the actual person behind the facade come out when they said cut. I don't know if you noticed that, but that spoke volumes to me when they did that.
I did not catch that. Going back to the steroid thing real quick, they do also have, it's a passing mention, but David Shoemaker does mention, hey, there were allegations that Vince's team was witness tampering during the steroid trial too. So I that's another little thing that does get mentioned. You are alluding to, I think, Dave Meltzer, who is featured prominently in this entire thing. And I think for the most part does a really good job. Like whatever you think of Dave now and his take on current things, like he is one of the preeminent wrestling historians.
The singular.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And was there. He was on the Donahue show with Vince McMahon, like that whole thing. Yeah. So like he does a really good job of pushing back on a lot of the things that WWE and Vince McMahon like to push to say this is how it was, and he'd say, "Well, no, it wasn't really like that." Yada yada. So whatever you think of the stupid WrestleMania 3.
Well, no, that's why
size.
I singled that out. Meltzer was fantastic in the documentary. I mean, let's be honest, he was great. He was the perfect person to kind of lend truth to questionable statements and provide actual, facts and introspection into items that perhaps weren't clear. All of that, not disparaging his ability and contributions to the documentary. The WrestleMania 3 shit was absolutely ridiculous, and he's been the chieftain of that since the beginning. That I had a problem with. It had no place here. It was ridiculous. They spent way too much time on it. We're spending way too much time on it. But no, he deserves his flowers because he was really good throughout the rest of it. That part, there was actually 2 parts that I had a problem with. One was that. The other we'll get to in a couple episodes.
One other thing, I think it's in this episode too. This was a Phil Mushnick heavy episode. The second one. Was. And whatever you think of Phil Mushnick and all the other stuff, the main thing you get out of him in this series, and the main point he tries to make is nobody else was talking about this stuff. And so he felt like he had to. And Meltzer,
that's the thing. Let me interrupt you.
Meltzer backs him up a few times on this stuff too, especially on the Ring Boy scandal and some other things. It's like, the mainstream news, that's that fake crap, whatever. Nobody would, whatever you think of the other stuff Phil did. I think that theme that, hey, there was some really shady stuff going on that a lot of people ignored was important because it also explains how Vince got to where he was at the end and when it all came crashing down.
Yeah, I push back against that to a degree, and they actually showed you why, right? Because he would say something like, the mainstream media wasn't really covering this. And then literally the documentarians would show 8 different headlines about the thing he was talking about. Now, it's certainly possible that was on like page 7 of the newspaper as opposed to page 1, or it wasn't covered on CNN or whatever the case might be. But to suggest that a lot of these things weren't covered is ridiculous. I grew up during this era. I ran a professional wrestling newsletter during much of this era. Not all of it, but certainly much of it. And I remember all of it being covered. That is, for me, and clearly you can tell that I have an issue with Mushnick in general, but it was clear to me that throughout his career, and certainly in this documentary, he was saying, well, that wasn't really covered. I was the only guy actually doing it, to lift himself up and say, look what I achieved and look what I spoke truth to power about when no one else did. It's not true. Others did. But was he the loudest voice and the most consistent? Sure. Maybe. But that also came along. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Also came along with him muckraking occasionally and him being such a consistent critic that he was going beyond like the actual atrocious shit that was happening behind the scenes and overly criticizing the actual product because the Parents Television Council didn't like it or some other bullshit. So I'm not saying he had no value, and he certainly had value in the documentary, no question. But I also thought it was a very self-serving perspective that he provided on his contribution to McMahon's coverage.
But I think all that stuff you laid out is also why he is a character in this story.
Oh, sure.
Because he was the New York Post and such a prominent thing, that it was important to include him for that reason. Because he was, and Vince pushes back on Mushnick and calls him crap or whatever like that.
Don't forget, and look, the New York Post is not the paper of record, right, in New York, but it's one of the 2 major papers in the big city where pretty much WWE was headquartered. I know it's Stamford, Connecticut, but they were a New York company very much. So no, his perspective was valuable. It was just the amount. And what I was really talking about in the open of the show was the way he handled himself in the paper and in his column, not so much in this documentary. In the documentary, he just spoke truth. I mean, it was pretty legit. Gotcha. Yeah. So I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. He was fine in the doc, but no, it was the hundreds of columns I read over decades.
People who may not know him, like if he just shows up, who's the New York Post guy? I never read the Post. I don't know who he is. That's what happened.
There's no perspective provided on him though. Like when they put him on screen, they're basically saying this is a journalist, and I'm not saying he's not a journalist at all, but he's certainly not a reporter. He's a columnist. He's a sports columnist for the New York Post, which people certainly have opinions about that outlet, right? Especially these days, but even back then. So you have to put that into context when you listen to what he's saying and the people he spoke to, and he called himself an informant for the FBI because they read all of his critical columns. That's how important he was.
That was weird. That line confused me.
But that was him lifting himself up and puffing his chest out and saying, look what I did. I tried to take down McMahon and I almost succeeded. Like, there was...
I think Vince said the steroid trial happened because of him, he thinks.
I think he believes that true. And I also, to your point, you mentioned this earlier, maybe they messed with witnesses and shit. Maybe. But the other truth about that is the government didn't really have a case on McMahon. Which Meltzer says. Right. Meltzer says it. Hogan obviously says it too. So like they said, well, he might have been witness tampering. Okay. Like maybe he was, and that's certainly illegal and wrong. Like no question about it. But also the government probably would have lost that case anyway. So it didn't matter much. Episode 2 ends just with the first touches of WCW and Hogan admitting that he promised Vince upon being granted his release that he would not compete against him, only to obviously turn around and join in WCW soon after. I don't remember whether that detail was out previously, but they certainly shared it there.
Real quick, I think that was this episode. I hadn't known the whole story behind No Holds Barred. That was actually really funny. That Vince and Hogan just wrote it together, and it was terrible.
It's certainly not surprising if you've ever seen it, because it is absolutely horrendous. Yeah, it's terrible. Okay, episode 3 was called Screwjob, and it was bookended by the 2 most notable screw jobs in WWE history, Wendy Richter on the front end, of course, and Bret Hart on the back end. It covered the failure of Lex Luger, having him kind of replace Hulk Hogan, Bret being the torchbearer for the WWE New Generation, and all of that as WCW opened its checkbook to compete and steal talent, the curtain call with the Click, breaking kayfabe, WCW, the NWO takeover, pretty much all of that. It interestingly skipped over the entire formation of Raw until talking about Nitro starting and going head to head with it. Speaking about WCW and Bischoff competing with him and trying to knock him off, you could actually tell McMahon had a level of respect for it looking back. Surely it helped because he won the war at the end. Vince did seem to admit hypocrisy, being angry about WCW poaching his talent when that's pretty much exactly what he did to the AWA and other territories. He clarified that stance. It's largely what he had to say publicly to gain sympathy for himself and WWE. They relitigated the Montreal Screwjob, saying Vince didn't walk in to Bret's locker room to get punched. They actually tied up, and Bret landed a huge uppercut that knocked him out cold. Bret's told that story before. I'm sure he appreciated getting that out there on a major platform as opposed to the WWE version of the Montreal Screwjob that most people know. And I thought it was also interesting that Vince, even to this day, he doesn't regret the Screwjob, and he doesn't regret going in the locker room and getting punched. He says he deserved the punch, and he did, ultimately. But let's not forget, Bret screwed Bret.
Most of this episode is something you've already seen in a WWE documentary. Several, actually, considering how many they do on the Screwjob in the Monday Night Wars. But it was a reminder in that Screwjob scene. They show some of the Beyond the Mat footage. Mm-hmm. And that was a documentary.
Excellent.
That turned out to be a bigger thing than it planned when it started. Mm-hmm. And that within this documentary, which is kind of the same thing, which just kind of goes to show you how unpredictable wrestling can be and the value of just being in the right place at the right time and getting some unbelievable footage and opinions and having that stuff. So I didn't see it credit Beyond the Mat like on the screen at all, but a lot that footage, if you've seen Beyond the Mat, that's where it's from, which is probably the greatest wrestling documentary of all time.
I think that's probably fair to say. You absolutely should see Beyond the Mat. Speaking of like getting screeners for this, I saw a sneak preview of Beyond the Mat because I was doing the newsletter at the time. They were doing a showing in Boca Raton, right by the mall, the movie theater over there. And I got a chance to see it with the creator and a couple key people that were in the film. I was very young at the time, obviously. But I saw it before it was out, before people saw it. And it's fantastic, straight up. So you should actually go out of your way.
I think it's all on YouTube for free. I'm pretty sure I've watched it there before.
I'm sure even if it's not supposed to be, that it is. So I'm sure people can find it. Back to Mr. McMahon. Episode 4 was Attitude. Of course, the rise of the Attitude Era, Degeneration X, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Obviously, the character of Mr. McMahon, along with the violence and misogyny that came from that era. And of course, the divas in WWE. The episode concluded with Owen Hart's death. McMahon told the story of his fascination with Dr. Jerry Graham, the wrestler, and how he emulated his strut and wanted to be like him. He's spoken about that briefly before. You can Google and read up more about that. We had a conversation about Vince versus Mr. McMahon, the characteristics and qualities that separate them. He said there's no comparison whatsoever. They're totally different people. But right after he said that, he already seems to not believe what he said, and he ultimately accepts that the perception is the reality, even though he claims it's not. Pritchard, who obviously is McMahon's right-hand man, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, Austin. Right after McMahon says this, there's no comparison between us whatsoever. They all agree it is Vince, just obviously exaggerated. And it was at this moment in the documentary, and it's something that you see throughout, but especially episodes 4, 5, and 6, I started to think that Vince, like, again, armchair psychologist here, might have some type of like dissociative disorder. It's either that or he's just an incredible liar, because he seems to just not understand that this character he played is literally him, to the point that many of the things he did with women on screen, we now know, are extremely similar to things he did with women off screen, if not exactly the same. And this actually shows itself to a degree. There's like a Daily Show style supercut. McMahon said the Attitude Era was still family friendly television. It was just a standard deviation, a little bit more adult. He said no one got killed. There was no rape, no knives, no guns. And then they showed footage from Raw where pretty much every single one of those things happened in order to what he explained.
Including Vince calling someone a rapist.
Vince called someone a rapist. There was 2 guys, I forget if it was DX, I think it was someone else other than DX, like grabbing a woman by the feet with the door closing as if they were going to take advantage of her. Literal choppy PP, like swords, I guess, in that case, but fine, creative license. And then Brian Pillman with the gun. I mean, it was one after another. And I was just like, man, this guy, he's either just lying through his teeth, which I'm sure was part of it, but even beyond that, he seems to have this dissociative disorder where he can't put these two parts of his life together. I'm not talking about character versus man. I'm talking about reality and then the character and how it was built off of reality. And I would also mention here, they briefly showed DX in blackface. It was X-Pac they showed, not Triple H, but I still thought it was shocking they did that. And lastly, from this episode, Vince maintained without a second thought his decision to let the show go on after Owen's death, which, I mean, I think it's one thing to do it in the moment. It's another to look back at it all these years later and say, yeah, that was the right decision, because it clearly was not. And Brett also shared his forgiveness of Vince, saying it was professional and not personal between them. He may have thought at the time that Vince did it, on purpose and did it as retribution to him. But once the cop called him and said, hey, look, man, this was an accident. It sucks. I'm so sorry. He let it go. And he said that before. But for any claims that this documentary was one-sided, that was kind of proof to me that it was not.
Yeah, that was one of the things I'd written down from this episode as well. The Vince stuff, like you said, they kind of spend the whole second half of the series. Vince says, oh, Mr. McMahon is not Vince. But then they basically spend the rest of the documentary showing you that it is. And you can't, therefore you can't trust Vince when what he says about himself.
Exactly.
With that supercut, like you said. I think this episode did a really good job too of, I think, fairly explaining that the Attitude Era was of its time. It wasn't, it was crazy, but that's because pop culture was crazy at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is a lot of those things from back then are not still around. Girls Gone Wild is not around. Jerry Springer Show is not around. But WWE is. So it gets compared back to what it was, and we'll have to forever take the heat for some things that it did during that time. But it really was just reading where society was and leaning into that, and not just, hey, let's do terrible things because we want to do terrible things. And that's not to excuse any of it. I think it's just important context as to why. And Triple H and Stephanie, and they're all like, yeah, I can't believe we did that stuff. We wouldn't do it now. And I think that's fair.
I wish
they're not the only people in society that can say that.
I wish they showed that out more, though, because like I've made comparisons on this podcast many times about Howard Stern and how Howard Stern from the 90s and early 2000s is completely different from the guy that you have now on the radio, because he evolved as he got older and as times changed. And his audience also grew up and evolved with him. I listened to him and watched him on E all the way back then. And I promise you, those episodes of TV on the E network at 11 o'clock when Jenna Jameson is on there, that spoke to me as a teenage boy. And now, I mean, I'm not saying that wouldn't speak to me as a man, but I'm certainly more interested in Howard interviewing Billy Joel, right? Because I'm older, and that's what piques my interest. So I kind of wish, as they were showing all of this about the WWF Attitude Era, and they were kind of making these statements, that they actually made comparisons, and they showed here were other things happening in pop culture at the time. And WWE was very much part of that. I don't think it hurt the doc that they didn't, but I think it would have helped it if they did. That's all. So moving to episode 5, which was called Family Business. It included the involvement of Shane, Stephanie, and Linda, both behind the scenes and more actually in front of the camera. WWE going public and buying WCW. Also many of the failures that came after that, including the XFL, the World Wildlife Fund lawsuit, the decline of business after Austin retired, and all of that into the rise of John Cena and kind of the PG era of WWE. Vince, at the start of this episode, extremely quickly said the word incest about his childhood. There had been rumors that McMahon was sexually assaulted by a family member as a child, but there has never been any deeper look into that. And I'm assuming they heard that and followed up here, but it certainly wasn't shown if they did. He said that word as fast as I've ever heard someone say a word like that, just to kind of like acknowledge it and then go past it. But
there is a mention. I don't know if it's by Shoemaker or Paul Heyman, about rumors that Vince was molested by his mother. They
did say that? Okay.
They do. They show his mother.
Because I knew that, but I didn't know if they said that. Okay.
And I don't remember who's speaking over it, but they do like make a passing mention that there have been those rumors. Yeah. I don't know if it was in that. I don't know exactly what part of the.
No, it was definitely a different part of it, because I rewound it to make sure. But he does say that, so I thought that was super effing interesting. Let me just say. You mentioned this earlier. Vince suggested Paul and Steph have their wedding, or actual wedding, on pay-per-view, and obviously Stephanie refused because she wouldn't ever want that in a million years. And I also didn't realize that the street fight between Vince and Steph was 6 days before their actual wedding, which is absolutely wild. These were a couple of the few revelations that we were actually able to take, and you learned something coming out of it, and it was kind of fun, as opposed to all the disgusting shit. They covered the Sable lawsuit and return. Wasn't really in great detail, largely because it was ultimately dropped, I believe, before Discovery. Heyman said Vince's only true monogamous relationship in his life was with WWE, which obviously speaks to his multiple affairs, whether consensual or, as we know, some not. There was discussion with Shane and Vince of buying UFC, and we've always wanted to know how they actually both felt about that not happening. Vince didn't like it because it was not character-driven. He said, we're in show business. That's a sport. Thought it was interesting to hear that actually discussed. And then Paul Heyman told an incredible story at the end of this episode about Vince and Shane getting so heated over a creative idea that Vince basically said to him, over my dead body. Then he was eating dinner at the time, handed him a knife, opened up his jacket, and told him to stab him in the heart. And he said, if you don't go through with it, you're not man enough to let your idea win. He said, or if you don't want to stab me, you can buy me out the way I did my father. And if not, you're going to have to get rid of me the same way I did him. This was what led, seemingly, I mean, they connect the dots, to Shane ultimately leaving WWE for that time, like in 2009. It's the first time they discussed that as well. Vince said Shane wanted to lead, but it was his company, and he wasn't ready to give it up. And they were just opposed on everything and grew apart. And Chris, I know you had the same thought I did. I'm thinking about Logan Roy when, the younger son is ready to come in and lead, or I guess the biggest boy, or what did he say in the show? The eldest boy.
Number one boy.
No, eldest boy, I think is what he said. That was actually Connor who says it in the show.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of that in that, hey, Shane's like, look, old man, it's time for me to take the reins and contribute and be a part of this. And Vince is like, I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm working. I have no desire to do that. And Shane's like, well, if he's not going to step aside or let me help him, then I'm going to dip. So I thought that everything with Vince and Shane here, and they kind of talk about it again in the next episode, but that was some of the most revealing stuff in the entire documentary.
Yeah, that anecdote from Heyman was wild. That conversation, I would have loved the details of like how he told, like if I'm a reporter, like I'm following up, I want to know the specifics, how he told Vince, where he was when he told him.
What was his reaction to it?
Was.
Yep, totally.
Yeah, we didn't, but maybe Shane just didn't want to give that. It's certainly possible. And the part about the only monogamous relationship with WWE, that's when they pull back to the Playboy interview.
Mm-hmm.
When Vince admits to affairs, says the sex was great, but emotionally he shouldn't have done that. And they asked Vince just plainly, like, why did you do this interview with Playboy? That's kind of been one of the kind of mysteries around this whole thing. Like everything we know about Vince, we know because it's on the Wikipedia page of Vince McMahon and it cites the Playboy interview from 99 or 2000.
Much of it, yeah.
Or whatever it was. And Vince seems to kind of have regret doing that. But or at least he didn't think it was as big of a deal at the time. There's a lot of interesting stuff from Vince, Triple H, and Stephanie and Howard Stern back in the day that is kind of wild that they did at the time and in revealing certain things and saying certain
I'm shocked none of that was in the doc. I was going to say that at the end. Yeah,
right. So they do. He does seem to kind of regret talking about that at the time, which I just, again, thought was kind of an interesting look into his mind and the way he's thinking about things and all that.
So that was episode 5. Episode 6, of course, is the last one, and it's appropriately called The Finish. It covers the Battle of the Billionaires, which you mentioned earlier, the limo explosion, and Benoit, of course, the early deaths of wrestlers, the switch to TVPG, surprising, strong, and comprehensive focus on Shane, basically making him out to be the good guy of the entire family, even though in the same breath, basically, a USA Network exec literally calls him the black sheep of the McMahon family, which I think is not at all an accurate description of Shane. And it kind of wrapped up to current with all of the allegations, Janelle Grant we talked about, the resignation, etc. And it even touched on Ashley Massaro at the end, though Benoit and Massaro, as I was kind of going through this whole documentary, I'm like, I wrote the note down. I'm like, man, they didn't cover either of those. I'm surprised they missed them. And then boom, they come right around to episode 6. They touch on both of them. McMahon has a mention early in this episode where he says, I feel like I have multiple computers in my brain at the same time.
Yep.
And while he was doing that interview, which happened way before the sexual misconduct, assault, and trafficking allegations came out, the ones that led to his demise from WWE, he literally said that he was thinking about sex while they were doing the interview. And I could only imagine being an editor of this film and going through all the hours like, hey, you know, wasn't there something he said in interview 4 about thinking about sex while we were talking? Let me go find that. And like finding that clip and being like, holy shit, this is perfect for episode 6. I loved that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that took me back to what you said before about the disassociation disorder. He's like, I have two brains, maybe even a third. And
right.
the interview asks him, what is the second one thinking right now? And he just is like, sex. Like, oh, Jesus Christ. But
who says that while they're sitting down for an interview for a docuseries about their life? I mean,
this is why every moment Vince was on screen, I just found interesting.
Yeah.
Because one, it's like we've never heard him talk about this stuff, and then 2, it's like, why are you saying this and why are you thinking it? And that was a perfect example of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to just, I like, obviously considering what came out, like, you totally believe him. Like, what kind of like state are you in at that point? The Shane stuff, the Shane and Stephanie succession stuff in here was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Shane comes back. He makes the big apparent return. He does the Hell in the Cell match with The Undertaker.
It's not 2016.
Yes. When he comes, yes. And I noticed at the end, this was actually a really touching scene. Shane takes his kids out to do the entrance. We know that. He comes back afterward and he's got a big hug with all of his sons, just hugging all of them. And Vince is standing right there looking at this. And in the moment, I'm thinking, like, this is the relationship Vince doesn't have with his kids and he didn't have with his father. And that it explains a lot. And then Shane turns and him and Vince embrace for quite a while. And Shane, I think, says at that moment, Vince said, I love you or respect you or something along those lines.
He was proud of him and he loved him.
And Shane's like, I think Shane said it was like the first time he'd ever like really said that. And I thought that was a really touching moment. And just, again, kind of explains the whole dynamics of everything. But to your point about Shane being the nice one, Tony Atlas has a great line here where he says, Shane was the nice one, but you can't be nice and be the boss in wrestling because then everybody will take advantage of you. And the flip side of that is Stephanie, who's just like Vince. You can't push her around, yada yada,
right?
That kind of stuff.
Seems to be well liked and still nice, but not a pushover. And at least Atlas believed individually, because other people didn't speak on it. At least Atlas believed, and I really don't know why he would have that much perspective on Shane, given they really weren't in the company at the same time, especially when Shane was older. But in his perspective, Shane would not, for lack of a better term, nut up the same way Stephanie did. But talking about Shane, he got really emotional talking about this return. And it wasn't just the fact that he was back after, 7 years or whatever, but it was the response the crowd gave him, which did include, and they showed it in its entirety. I appreciated that. Not in its entirety, but most of it. One of the best reactions that WWE got in those years when fans were really protesting the product.
That show was in Detroit when he came back. And I almost went to that Raw. Okay. And I decided not to.
No salmon jacket repeat for you. Since. Yeah, because that was exceptional. And one of my strongest takeaways, really, from the entire series is somewhat of what you just said. It's that Vince clearly didn't learn from the mistakes his father made. In fact, he almost seems to repeat many of them verbatim, maybe even purposely, when it comes to his relationship with Shane. But Shane seemingly has learned from Vince's mistakes and broken the cycle the way he relates to his kids. And that was immensely touching. I was still surprised that much time was spent on Shane, but I think they purposefully wanted to juxtapose the relationship he had with his kids and the relationship he had with Vince, and also kind of take us through the journey of how the eldest boy was not the heir apparent as pretty much anyone naturally. No offense to Steph, and certainly no sexism meant or anything like that. But especially back in the 90s, you would expect the oldest son is going to be the one to take over WWE, and how and why that did not happen. And candidly, why Shane is most likely a much better person and father because of it.
Yeah, there was part of me here was like, I kind of wanted to do just a Shane only episode. Like, they didn't get all, again, it wasn't about him, but I was like, they didn't get it all into what Shane was doing while he was gone. I know he worked with some video on demand company in China and something like.
I think he did like a weed company too, if memory serves.
I don't really totally know what he was doing, and they didn't get into that. And it wasn't the most important thing because it is a documentary about Vince and it's about the relationship between Shane and Vince. But you're right. What they did focus in on Shane was about the father-son relationship and how that explains a lot about Vince.
It does. A couple other items from this episode. I thought it was pretty uncomfortable, at least these days in 2024, watching this, seeing Stone Cold basically saying he doesn't believe in CTE at all.
Yeah.
And Vince saying he initially didn't believe in it. And he did, or I should say more that he didn't believe it was the reason for the Benoit murder-suicide. But once Chris Nowinski spoke with him and told him, hey, this can be preventative. And even if you don't believe in it, to protect your people, WWE did come around in the end. And they did the right thing, changing their rules. And that was one of the rare opportunities where McMahon got some praise from a third party saying, hey, he did the right thing ultimately, even if, again, when it came to Benoit, he's like, that wasn't the reason. Some people are just crazy assholes is pretty much what he said. But Stone Cold saying, yeah, I don't believe in that CTE shit. I mean, luckily he doesn't seem to be suffering from it. But I mean, that was...
Yeah, that was kind of wild.
It was. Took me aback.
But like, They have Undertaker getting mad that they got rid of chair shots to the head.
Right.
But then him coming around and be like, like, I get it. So,
right.
And yeah, like,
but Austin didn't. Undertaker's like, I don't like it, but I get it. Well, and Austin's just like, I don't like it. It's bullshit.
Austin's explanation is if you're getting a bunch of concussions in wrestling, you're not doing it right.
Which is just not true. Yeah.
Like, freak accidents happen all the time.
I've said this before. You can soccer players get concussions from heading the ball, which is part of their job. Simple as that. Yeah. I mean, so yes, you can get concussions from whiplash, from a million other things in a wrestling ring, even if you're doing everything exactly as you were taught. So I thought that was bullshit. Lesnar over Taker at WrestleMania, last minute decision. Was that known?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's been said, and I don't think it was ever explained. But my theory on that whole case, which they didn't get into, this is something they could have gotten into, but that was the first thing on the WWE network was WrestleMania 30. And so I've always had the theory Vince wanted to make a splash.
Absolutely.
On the network.
Absolutely.
And I would have loved for him to explain, because he was ahead of the game on streaming with the WWE.
Right.
Network.
They don't even cover that at all.
When you talk about you could have gotten into the business stuff there, which would have been interesting, I think. But they used that WrestleMania 30 thing to jump back into Undertaker got hurt in that match.
Mm-hmm.
And Vince was there with his wife and was consoling her and stuff like that. So it's another one of those rare, like, hey, Vince was being a good guy to me type of stuff.
There were probably two reasons. One, the WWE Network thing that you mentioned. The other was that he wanted to go full bore behind Lesnar and make him like the preeminent star. In order to do that, he wanted him to beat The Undertaker. And of course, that was also kind of the kickoff for Lesnar and Reigns being the two top dogs. We actually talked about this on our Tuesday show when we were talking about Roman Reigns and Cody and comparisons to Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Vince really wanted Reigns and Lesnar to be like the preeminent feud in WWE that would carry the company. And it obviously just didn't work because people didn't buy into his version of Reigns.
But for the record, I do think that ended up being the good decision because it changed Brock's everything.
It did.
That ultimately helped everybody else.
That's a longer conversation for a different show. I don't know if I agree that it was a good decision. It definitely helped Lesnar. I think there's other ways that could have been achieved. Taker winning, you rematch it, Lesnar wins. Like, you didn't have to do it at WrestleMania. You didn't have to break the streak. I mentioned there was a second issue I had with something the M&M boys, let's call them, had to say. They said fans didn't care that wrestlers were dying. That's absolute horseshit. WWE was definitely slow to act to get a handle on the steroid and painkiller situation. But to say fans didn't care because they were TV characters is just wrong and frankly insulting to millions of people who absolutely did care, but they were powerless to do anything about it. So that pissed me off.
I wouldn't say didn't care, but as someone who was not totally watching wrestling at the time, remember hearing that Tess died and being like, oh man, hearing that Crash Holly died. Oh man, I liked him back in the day. And I think for a lot of casual fans, that was a lot of reactions. I think that's what they were trying to get. They were trying to emphasize that WWE could get through all these people dying young because they can just cycle through characters.
But that's not what they said. I mean, they basically said fans didn't give a shit, so it was okay.
They didn't say fans didn't give a shit.
Yes, they did. They said they don't care.
That's overplaying it.
No, it's not.
That's overplaying it as well.
It's not. They basically said since fans didn't really care, so on and so forth. I mean, those words were utilized. Maybe I'm wrong and I wrote the note down wrong, but I have it in quotes. So
no,
it's certainly possible.
That was the general vibe was yes, like there wasn't an uproar among fans to stop it.
That wasn't really the case though. I mean, maybe the media was not on top of it. In fact, the media wasn't on top of it to say, why is all of this happening? They would cover it every single time a wrestler died. The media would why are so many wrestlers dying young? It would be a one-day story. It would go away. It would never be touched on again. That was problematic for journalism, and it was probably problematic for the United States government not looking into it more and trying to figure out what the hell is going on in professional wrestling that all these people are dying. But that is very different from saying fans didn't care. So that bothered me. I just wanted to point that out. I told you there were two issues. That was the second one. There was also a huge cut of the whole father figure line for Vince, including Taker getting really emotional talking about Vince being like a father figure to him. AEW does get a cursory mention, nothing real specific. Vince said succession plans for WWE were always dependent on his ability to contribute. But since he never saw himself retiring, he never actually made plans for his succession because it wouldn't have mattered. And that surely spoke to everything with Stephanie and Shane that we've known for a long time. Everyone, of course, there was another supercut of everyone saying he would never retire. That immediately preceded the final 20 minutes of the documentary focusing on the Wall Street Journal report and everything that subsequently happened. McMahon canceled final interviews for the series after the allegations came out. And I mentioned earlier what Pritchard had to say in January 2024. He said he had seen a bunch of episodes of the documentary. They included his thoughts, which I thought was important to do because he thought it was unfair and one-sided. And, then right after he finishes speaking, the documentarians say 2 days later, the other set of accusations comes out, which of course was Royal Rumble weekend, about sexual assault and trafficking and all that. They made Pritchard look like a total asshole in that moment when he certainly, plausible deniability and all, he certainly might not have known anything like that happened. And he certainly did not know that lawsuit was coming out because that caught everyone by surprise. So it was slightly unfair to have him be front and center and then say 2 days later this happened, then not kind of come back to him or someone else. But of course, he wasn't going to sit down for an interview after that happened. So understandable to a degree, but also slightly unfair. And there is the plausible deniability that you do need to mention when it comes to something like that.
Yeah. They talked to the Wall Street Journal reporters who broke the original story. They talked to the one who broke the story about the lawsuit being filed. They get into graphic detail about the details. And I think Shoemaker makes a good point. He's like, I thought he goes something like, I thought there was nothing about Vince that could surprise me. And this floored me.
Yeah.
And they talk about the text messages and a lot of that stuff. Talk about Brock Lesnar being named in the story. And
they also say, by the way, that the only text messages that were included were Vince's. So they didn't see her responses. Correct. So again, we talk about, the documentary being fair. They, were heavy on this at the end, but at the same time, they did kind of acknowledge this is a lawsuit. It's one side of the story, and we never saw her text. So yes. They did at least give us that, or give the viewer, I should say that.
And it was the Wall Street Journal reporter who said that.
Yes, that person admitted it. Correct. Yeah.
And there's a funny moment. They edited this really well, this whole series. Mm-hmm. Like you said, some of the super cuts, and then you cut to something that's contrary to what was just said. Mm-hmm. And one of those was when Vince first stepped away in 2022. They interviewed Meltzer in 2022, and they ask him, do you think Vince will ever come back? And he says, yes. Mm-hmm. And he was right. And then they immediately cut to Meltzer 2 years later, coming back to the exact same spot for the interview to further talk about everything that happened. I thought that was a really well produced bit of television or what have you there. And so I thought they handled that all well and kind of got the main points across.
They did indeed. So look, that wraps up Mr. McMahon. I think, we came into this and, we'll be candid with everyone. Hey, Chris, let's, do 30, 45 minutes on Mr. McMahon. Here we are, hour 15 plus. This is what we do here on the Getting Over Wrestling podcast. You get us going. We talk forever. But I feel we gave this more than a cursory overview. Let's put it that way.
There was one thing I guess we can go on this quick.
Sure.
But
real quick,
the fact that there is a line from Shoemaker at the end. He goes about Vince McMahon. Anything good he did is inextricable from everything bad he did. And this comes at a time when WWE's leaned heavily into the Paul Levesque era. Mm-hmm. Stephanie came back for WrestleMania 40. And you've had WWE TKO really trying to move past the Vince stuff. Now, this wasn't, again, WWE did not have anything to do with this. Mm-hmm. But do you feel like this will further WWE's attempt within itself to almost erase Vince from its history internally?
So I don't think that is entirely possible, nor do I believe they will ultimately try to do that. when push comes to shove. Because that would almost be too insulting to suggest that he was never part of the company and wasn't the reason for everything. He's literally the most important figure in professional wrestling history. And as we also noted, the greatest villain, right? From kayfabe standpoint in wrestling history and really reality standpoint as well. I do believe that WWE can look at this and say, let's tie a bow on it and we can move on. Like, it was covered and handled. You know, look, more's going to come out. We have to remember the lawsuit right now, I believe, is on hold because the Justice Department is taking a much deeper look at McMahon. So
that is not going away. Like, there's still a lot to go for that.
Well, that's not going away unless there's perhaps a change at the top of our government, which, you know, let's just kind of leave it at that. But that's not going away in theory. And even if it was to, for some reason, Grant's lawsuit is waiting on the other side of it. So McMahon's name will be in the news. WWE's company name will be in the news. So they're not extricating themselves from Vince or anything that he allegedly did anytime soon. When it comes to the on-air product and the day-to-day of the company, I mean, they've already done a decent job kind of handling that separation. There will probably be criticism that this documentary doesn't touch on all the other people who absolutely had to know or might have known or should have known or all that type of stuff. The documentary, I got to stress this again, it was not a piece of investigative journalism. They were not looking to turn over new stones. Also, it is not about WWE. It's about Vince McMahon. It's a portrait of this one individual. So I was not really looking for that, nor was I expecting that. If this was a documentary about the scandals, particularly those unveiled from 2022 to 2024, then yes, I would have been immensely disappointed that that wasn't covered. Right. But that wasn't the purpose of what they were doing here. And I thought they achieved a significant level of success with the documentary, more so for people who are not overly familiar with WWE and Vince McMahon. If you are a layman and you put this on, you're going to say, holy shit. And you're going to learn an absolute ton. And you're going to have a very definitive perspective about this person. And you're going to have the opportunity to create your own opinion on the company and its product and many of those types of things. If you come into this with knowledge at our level, beyond our level, or slightly below our level, fans of WWE and professional wrestling, you're going to walk out of it saying, yeah, I knew, 90% of that. But to your point, Chris, the fact that you get McMahon on the record talking about some of it, whether he's telling the truth or not, it's immensely unique and it's not something that we've ever experienced before. So it's an achievement either way. And I think a lot of the reviews I saw that were kind of being negative about it were saying, well, we didn't learn anything new and they didn't do this or that. Okay, yeah, but it wasn't really made for you who knows everything. It's made for a general sports audience and a general entertainment audience and people who, like I, would never know shit about big cat reserves, but then watch Tiger King and was enthralled by the entire thing. It's the same thing. There's tons of people who have never known shit about professional wrestling or WWE. And they're going to hear about this and they're going to watch this and they're going to say, holy shit, I can't believe all that stuff happened in wrestling. So that perspective needs to be taken account for. And I really believe a lot of people are missing that.
Yeah, I've talked to some of my friends who watched Netflix documentaries and I was like, hey, this is good. Like, you're going to want to watch this. I'm very curious the kind of casual audience they get from it. My biggest takeaway from the documentary is you really do get a full understanding of Vince McMahon and who he is. The good, the bad, the why, the everything. And largely because you get so much of that from his perspective for the first time. Whatever you feel about him regarding any of it, a lot of it bad, you just have a better understanding of who he is. And that's something we've just never really gotten before. And that's why I found it really, really good. And they handled everything, I thought, quite well.
Yeah, and despite any flaws, it's compelling. And ultimately, if you're going to sit down and spend 6 hours watching something like this, you want it to be compelling, you want it to catch your attention and retain it. And, there's a lot of documentaries and movies and shows where you pick up your phone and you're scrolling, this is only catching my interest so much. That did not happen to me here. Yeah, I had my laptop open because I was taking notes for this show, but that was it. I was paying full attention, and I would have in any other situation. So that is perhaps the best compliment I can give to something like Mr. McMahon. All right, Chris, we just broke this the hell down for everyone. We basically gave you 1/4 of the documentary right here on the Getting Over Wrestling podcast, but you should watch it for yourself, of course. It is on Netflix, debuted Wednesday, or I should say premiered Wednesday, 3 a.m. Eastern. So it's there waiting for you right now as you listen to this show. We'd love to hear your thoughts, both on the documentary and certainly our coverage of it right here. So, of course, you can tweet us at Getting Overcast. You can email us gettingoverpod@gmail.com. And as I kind of give you that on the way out, allow me to remind you that the Getting Over Wrestling podcast
is all about Defy.
So head over to Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Leave a 5-star rating on Apple. Take a little extra time. Leave a 5-star written review if you do. Again, we will read it live right here on the show. As mentioned, follow us on Twitter at Getting Overcast for all the reasons mentioned, episode drops, news analysis highlights, send in comments for the show. Subscribe to us on YouTube at Getting Overcast. And please also remember,
I happen to love the number 5.
and we hope you do as well, because for $5 a month or $50 for the entire year, you can become an official Getting Overhead. Just visit buymeacoffee.com/gettingover. Sign up. You get instant reaction audio to every major TV show and exclusive news analysis posts on Friday. Again, that is buymeacoffee.com/gettingover. Please do not forget, we already have your weekly WWE episode in the podcast feed. We'll be talking NXT and AEW later this week. And then 1 week from now on Tuesday, we will have your WWE Bad Blood Ultimate Preview. So plenty of performance-enhancing audio coming for your earholes, courtesy of your friends right here at the Getting Over Wrestling podcast. For Vintage Chris Vanini, this is the Silver King, Adam Silverstein, signing off and leaving you with just 3 final words. Bye for now.